Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Rebecca Garcia Malone. I'm the Assistant Director of Vessel Services for T&T Salvage, and today's chair for this session titled I've Got 99 Problems. Of course, an ode to the famous Jay-Z hip-hop record, a favorite of mine. This session is going to offer a review of some recent emerging concerns and their potential solutions in the inland response and environmental arena. I am accompanied today by several industry leaders who are going to discuss resolutions to the rising concern of abandoned and derelict vessels littering our U.S. waterways, as well as the rising environmental and human health concerns of PFAS products in industrial facilities and AFFF film-forming foam. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the baton off to our first speaker, Mr. Devin Grennan, who's president of Global Diving and Salvage. He's going to discuss a national strategy recommendation for tackling commercial and abandoned and derelict vessels. Devin, I'll allow you to introduce yourself, but for any of our viewers who would like some more information about you, I'd like to direct them to the Clean Waterways replay portal for your full bio. Devin, floor is yours.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Devin Grennan. I'm the president of Global Diving and Salvage, which is a commercial diving and marine construction company out on the West Coast. I've been actively involved in the commercial derelict vessel challenge for almost 2 decades now. My first toe in the pool was working with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources derelict vessel removal program in its early stages in the early 2000s. Both working projects in the field and now working more on policy issues on a state and national level. It's near and dear to my heart because I've stepped foot on a number of these vessels. And my talk today is focused on developing a national strategy towards dealing with the issue of specifically commercial abandoned and derelict vessels. So no derelict vessel presentation doesn't start out without a great case study. And I'd like to talk just briefly about the fishing vessel Midas. Located in Snohomish County in Washington State, Steamboat Slough is known as a boat graveyard. It's where old vessels end up after their serviceable life has concluded, and it's kind of there, and these vessels are tucked away in kind of the labyrinth of waterways up in Snohomish County. The 100-foot commercial fishing vessel Midas was built in 1942, had a prosperous past in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska fishing. It had at least 5 different owners over her life, and records indicate that she sold for $4 million in 1987. The Midas was acquired by her last owner in 2014 and finally succumbed to age and lack of repair. Despite the registered owner's best intentions, they did not have the financial capacity to raise and dispose of the vessel when she sank. And the Washington State Department of Natural Resources had to step in to fund the removal in September of 2019. The abatement of hazardous materials and the deconstruction and disposal of the Midas was close to $500,000. And I use this as an example of just one vessel that kind of demonstrates the challenge related to commercial abandoned and derelict vessels. It's a literal drop in the bucket, analogous to the persistent problem across this country's coastlines and waterways. And I always like to start these presentations off with a case study. And unfortunately, after about, I think, 10 or 12 years of doing annual presentations about case studies, you start to develop quite a list of them. And it has a tendency to kind of downplay the issue. When you just do one case study, it seems like there's not a very significant issue. But this is just a handful of the projects that Global Diving and Salvage has been involved with over the past 10 years, just on the West Coast. So again, it kind of demonstrates that the challenge here is it's a drop in the bucket. Each case study is just a drop in the bucket of a much larger challenge that we have in front of us. So my presentation today is really focused on trying to develop a national strategy. It's time for a cohesive national policy to address the environmentally damaging and financially draining issue of commercial abandoned and derelict vessels, which I call CADVs. Federal funding meant to address other environmental considerations like marine oil spill response or clearing hazards to navigation or channel clearance. That funding is being siphoned away from its primary purpose to assist with CADV removal. and many coastal states whose derelict vessel programs are specifically designed to deal with recreational vessels, the removal of those are actually being eaten up by dealing with commercial abandoned and derelict vessels. A national strategy to reduce the current CADV backlog is necessary, and we need to have a policy to discourage the continued behavior that leads commercial vessels into abandoned and derelict status. So I'm recommending a consistently applied federal funding source, practical deconstruction options for commercial vessels to decrease the overall costs, and to develop a long-term regulations to discourage vessel transfer from commercial entities into private hands. So the first topic is kind of the inequity of the funding, and especially as it relates to CADVs. The Washington State Department of Natural Resources Derelict Vessel Removal Program was initially established on a fund through an annual tax on listed vessels of $1 per vessel foot. And although the program has been wildly successful and it's a model for imitation around the country, it also kind of demonstrates the fact that large amounts of their funding are actually going towards or being consumed to deal with commercial abandoned and derelict vessels. When a state's funding is inadequate or unavailable, often, and the CADV project meets regulatory guidelines, most notably a threat of imminent discharge, the United States Coast Guard has demonstrated a history of funding specific projects on a case-by-case basis through use of the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. This is the most consistent federal funding source that we've seen over the last 2 decades to deal with CADVs. There's a great report that came out in 2017 by the General Accounting Office titled Federal and State Actions, Expenditures, and Challenges in Addressing Abandoned and Derelict Vessels. And it provides some clarity on the complexity of the issue that we have with ADVs. But I feel like that report doesn't really target perhaps the most poignant segment of the challenge, which is commercial vessels themselves. Between fiscal years 2005 and 2015, this report reported that the Coast Guard had 34 abandoned and derelict vessel cases that resulted in a cost of $42.5 million in expenditures. I think the most surprising statistic is buried in the notes of that report, which is that $41.6 million of that 42.5 was expended on just 2 commercial derelict vessel projects. One was the MV Sea Witch in 2008 in Maryland, and the other was pictured here, the MV Davy Crockett in 2011 on the Columbia River between Washington and Oregon. So it really highlights the fact that these CADVs have a tremendous cost and impact on the funding sources. It's a predominance of where those funds go is to deal with not recreational vessels, but with commercial derelict vessels. And I think the bigger question really lies in the appropriateness of the existing sources that we're using for removal of CADVs. A single CADV can wipe out an entire state's annual budget to deal with abandoned and derelict vessels, which means there's often very little left for preventative measures that states are trying to impose, for recreational vessel turn-in programs, and especially since those vessels are so much less expensive to deconstruct and dispose of. It can really, the costs and the burden for commercial derelict vessels really burdens those state budgets and those state programs. And then secondly, at a federal level, why should the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund, which is financed by a per barrel tax on crude oil produced domestically or imported into the U.S., be used to remove a derelict fishing vessel that never paid into the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund in the first place? So some potential solutions to that funding. I think at a national level, there really needs to be a comprehensive evaluation to a national funding scheme between the states and the federal government to address the CADV inventory, while a long-term solution is being found. So we have a current backlog that's tremendous. And in my opinion, the use of the Coast Guard's Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund in the interim seems to be the most appropriate fund to use for that purpose. It's recently been reauthorized by Congress. There appears to be substantial funds available for CADV projects on a case-by-case basis. The Coast Guard has a demonstrated expertise in providing oversight for the abatement and deconstruction and disposal of these vessels. There could be some need to change some of the language within the funding, perhaps to allow a grant program for coastal states to administer on a local level. So at least in the interim, from my perspective, the OL or the OSLFT is the best funding source that we have currently to address CADVs. In the long term, I think there needs to be some conversation about an alternative public funding option. And two potential considerations are potentially an amendment to the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, as the harbor maintenance fee that was created based on the Water Resource Act of 1996. Those fees are intended to require those who benefit from the maintenance of U.S. ports and harbors to share the cost of that maintenance. And I think you could make an extension that removal of commercial derelict and abandoned vessels is in line with maintenance of U.S. ports and harbors. Separate from that, a separate funding source could be the establishment of a new tax specifically on construction of new vessels, or a tax on repair of existing commercial vessels, so that there's an actual public funding source that's built up over time to be a resource to draw upon should a CADV be necessary. Both of these recommendations align funding with the financial resources for eventual deconstruction with the operators who profit from or exercise the use of commercial vessels during their serviceable life. And then there's a question of why are deconstruction costs so high? Even if there was a more consistent funding source for removal, there's three significant hurdles that remain in the market that limit vessel deconstruction as a cost-effective solution. The first is that there's a tremendously high cost of hazardous materials abatement to prepare the deconstructed vessel for disposal. Gone are the days where you can just simply take your steel hull vessel to a scrapyard and you receive a scrap value for that vessel as is in one big piece. Any vessel deconstruction project requires an initial survey for hazardous materials, and typical concerns are oils and fuels, asbestos, PCBs, lead paint, anti-fouling systems, coolants, refrigerants, batteries, mercury. All those increase exponentially the cost of deconstruction. The second hurdle is that there's a lack of permitted and commercially viable facilities to perform those deconstruction options. People think of shipyards and graving docks as a great location to perform that work, but typically they're engaged in construction of new vessels and repair of existing vessels. Scheduling a single spot CADV removal project is often difficult. They're not using their own labor. They usually have to bring in specialized labor to perform that work. Most shipyards and graving docks are concerned about putting their National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, the NPDES permit, at risk, which usually requires zero discharge for a deconstruction activity that produces a tremendous amount of waste streams. And so ultimately, it doesn't make business sense for those traditional shipyards to engage in deconstruction activities of commercial vessels. And finally, some of these CADVs are not even in a position or in a location where they could be taken to a permitted facility. And so the deconstruction has to happen in situ, or they can be towed to a location that's not a permitted facility that's more convenient for disposal. And often that requires an emergency permit that's not consistently applied, which means that there's often vessels are left to decay in place and continue to degrade the environment rather than perform the work at that location to eliminate the environmental threat because of the permitting requirements. So some potential solutions to that high cost of deconstruction, and these are some of my recommendations, are there could be an incentivization program for permitted shipyards or graving docks to reconsider deconstruction operations as a potential revenue source. Number one, if there was enough backlog for there and funding and a consistent funding source for there to be an actual business line where they could perform those deconstruction activities, as well as looking at an alternative to using BMP's best management practices in lieu of the strict confines of the NPDES permit requirements. There could also be some tax incentives for those shipyards that want to engage in responsible, proper, legal vessel deconstruction. Another consideration might be the development of BMPs for in situ deconstruction. On this picture at the top, that's a vessel that couldn't be towed anywhere else, so we had to deconstruct it in a tide flat within the tide line, and we had to manage it very narrowly. And what we did with that is create basically a net environmental balance assessment trade-off, which is, do we leave the vessel in place? What are the environmental damages for doing that? Or if we deconstruct it in place in a controlled way, can we manage the waste streams and the disposal streams there? So I think looking at alternatives for deconstruction in place with BMPs when you can't go to a permitted shipyard is warranted. And then finally, I believe there's a need for review and revision of the current US EPA's scuttling permits, both in emergency and non-emergency situations. They're fairly restrictive, and oftentimes the work that needs to be done to scuttle a vessel makes it cost prohibitive to do anything other than take it to a permitted shipyard. And so really the question is, how does a commercial vessel become derelict, and what inhibits a solution to this challenge? And I'd like to talk very briefly about the tug vessel Florence Filberg, which I believe is a cautionary tale. The Florence Filberg was built in 1944, owned by the U.S. Army Transportation Service. It had another owner from 1946 to 1972, and at least 5 other owners until 2005, when she sank at her moorings in Fisherman's Terminal in Seattle. We were involved, my company was involved with this project. I stepped on board that boat as we lifted it up. She was both a hazard to navigation as well as an environmental threat. The vessel was picked back up and tied back to the same moorings where she sank. Fortunately, she did not sink there again, but in 2007, she was towed from Seattle to Sauk Harbor in Canada. In 2009, she was set ablaze through arson. And finally, the District of Sauk and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada struck a deal to fund the removal of her charred remains in 2011. Multiple owners, multiple jurisdictions, one vessel, but everybody's problem with trying to get rid of it. And I bring this up because the cost to construct a commercial vessel is extremely expensive. Commercial vessels are built to be used for profit enterprises or for governmental service. They've been built with an anticipated lifespan that usually extends multiple decades. The primary and secondary owners of these commercial vessels usually have the financial means to purchase the vessel at an appropriate price, and then more importantly, maintain it in a serviceable condition throughout their ownership. They make a profit off its use. And then at some point, a commercial vessel owner makes the decision to either properly dispose of the vessel, which we've already talked about can be very expensive, depending on age, condition, and construction materials, or simply sell it at a significant discount to another entity. And from there, it usually passes from transitional owner to transitional owner, moving from port to port, sometimes between states, sometimes between countries, in the example of the Florence Filberg, until age and condition catch up. The Lumberman, right here on the picture I have here, is located in Juneau, Alaska. It's been tied up at the dock for a number of years. On January 12th of this year, a combination of high tides and winds knocked it loose from its spot, and the tug drifted several hundred feet out of the state-controlled tidelands into city-controlled waters. The city and borough of Juneau, with assistance from the Coast Guard, towed the Lumberman to a city-owned pier and secured it there. And this notice that I have on this slide shows the challenge that municipalities and state agencies have when they take possession of the vessel. They now are responsible for the vessel until they can find another party to take it off their hands, or they are going to have to maintain it in its floating condition and potentially deal with its deconstruction and disposal later. But this notice is the city's efforts to distance itself from that conundrum of vessel possession, and they're attempting to sell the 79-year-old wood-hulled vessel for a minimum bid of $2,076.42. With minimal requirements on the new buyer as to what they'd have to have in place to take possession of the vessel from the city. Governmental agencies continue to routinely attempt to sell commercial vessels that are clearly past their serviceable lives, then opting for deconstruction and disposal because they don't have the funds to do so. The 123-foot fireboat Alki, built in 1927, and retired from service in 2013, was publicly auctioned online by the city of Seattle later that year in 2013, with no responsive bidders for the 93-year-old wood-hulled vessel. Fortunately, the city of Seattle opted to deconstruct the vessel in 2020 with assistance from the Washington State Department of Natural Resources and their derelict vessel funding program. But again, it's a cautionary tale that selling a public liability is often quicker and easier than paying for proper disposal. The Washington State Legislature establish requirements that sellers of vessels longer than 70 or 65 feet long and 40 feet of age must have the vessel surveyed and provide the buyer and the Department of Natural Resources with a copy of that survey, as well as the seller must also require the buyer to show proof of insurance for the vessel. And this may be an early model of how to limit the passage of vessel from owner to owner unrestricted, who cannot financially maintain the vessel once they own it. And as opposed to a publicly funded solution, there could be privately funded solutions to the problem of CADVs. And that may lay in new insurance products that cover the abatement and disposal of a commercial vessel based on the years of ownership and required by each subsequent owner, which basically means the insurance policy follows the vessel. When the last owner needs to get rid of the vessel, an intact insurance policy becomes more viable than simply finding a willing individual with dreams of converting the old tugboat into a youth hostel for out-of-work fishermen, which is a conversation I had in the late 90s down in the port of Astoria with an owner of a derelict vessel that had sank. An alternative approach could be the requirement of a surety bond placed on a commercial vessel based on its size and purpose that follows it through its life cycle, as each new owner would have to post a bond equal to the value or greater than the value of deconstruction and disposal of the vessel at its life's end. After all, if the initial purpose to build a commercial vessel is for a profitable enterprise or for government use, then why shouldn't that entity that received the profit or service of the commercial vessel be responsible for its costs associated with its eventual disposal? Why shouldn't proper deconstruction of a commercial vessel be included in the cost of doing business? So finally, my closing comments on the issue really is addressed to not only do we have a large amount of commercial vessels that are waiting to become environmental threats, but without a change in managing how these commercial vessels get into the hands of individuals who cannot properly maintain and dispose of them, the problem gets greater every day. You can bet that many commercial vessels plying our domestic waterways and right now that will eventually make their way into an owner who does not have the financial capacity to maintain it and will probably not be able to properly dispose of it. It'll eventually be tied to a dock. It'll be grounded in some tide flats where public funds will be required to dispose of it legally. And so although it's another business opportunity for salvage companies in the salvage industry and commercial enterprises like myself, this is not a sustainable trend financially or environmentally. And it's time for a proactive, comprehensive, and lasting solution to the challenging issue of commercial abandoned and derelict vessels. So that's the end of my presentation. Back to you, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Devin. I really appreciated that presentation. I do want to just take a quick moment to remind our viewers that not only do I have some questions for each of our speakers, but that you can also send your questions directly to them via the Clean Waterways portal. My questions will wait till the end after each speaker has provided their presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ryan Thomas, who's an environmental scientist at GHD. He's going to be speaking about the challenges and proactive considerations with PFAS. Again, for Dr. Thomas's full bio, please refer to the Clean Waterways replay portal. So without further ado, Dr. Thomas, the floor is yours, sir.
Hey, thanks for that introduction, Rebecca. I'm Ryan Thomas, scientist at GHD, and I lead our emerging contaminants work group. Additionally, I co-lead subgroups for the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council's PFAS team, where we're focused on compiling best available practices for environmental professionals on PFAS. And today we'll be focusing on some of the PFAS challenges and considerations. Next slide, please. Our agenda includes a discussion on what are PFAS and then touches on potential sources. Additionally, we'll discuss the current regulatory landscape and then dive into some sampling, analytical, and treatment challenges. Finally, we'll cover some proactive considerations. Next slide. So what are PFAS? PFAS is an umbrella acronym for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And in terms of this class of compounds, we see that PFAS consists of over 5,000 anthropogenic compounds, meaning not occurring naturally in the environment. And of these 5,000 plus compounds, only about 24 to 30 of them can be detected by commercially available analytical methods. These compounds are comprised of a carbon tail end that's hydrophobic or water repelling, oleophobic or oil repelling, and a head end that is hydrophilic. And really, it's these multiple properties found in one molecule that gives rise to the unique surface active properties leading to partitioning at the soil and water and air and water interfaces. Next slide. So there is a difference between per and then poly PFAS. And to understand that, we'll need to look at the molecules. Per PFAS are fully fluorinated, and that means that they have fluorine atoms attached to all bonding sites along the carbon chain, except where the functional group is attached, as shown in the diagram on the slide here. Carbon-fluorine bonds are very strong and difficult to degrade, and thus the per PFAS are quite persistent in the environment. Poly PFAS, however, are not fully fluorinated, which means an atom other than fluorine is attached to at least one of the bonding sites. And this bond creates more of a weak link in the chain that's more likely to degrade. And because of this, the poly PFAS have the potential to be transformed into a per PFAS. These differences between the molecules affect how they move through our environment. So per PFAS have high water solubility and low volatility generally, and allowing them to be easily transported in the surface and groundwater. But poly PFAS, on the other hand, have lower solubility and higher volatility, and allowing them to be easily move through the atmosphere. And since poly PFAS can be transformed into the per PFAS, this can be one of the reasons why we see some of PFAS there found in remote areas far from known sources where neither of them is volatile. And it appears that poly PFAS can travel these long distances through the atmosphere to somewhere from that source, and they are then eventually degraded into per PFAS. And it's this relationship between the per and poly PFAS that's important when we're considering background and source identification. Next slide, please. Now, as most of us know, PFAS have been, getting a lot of recognition and attention as contaminants of emerging concern. And the initial focus was on longer chain compounds such as PFOA and PFOS. And the use of these compounds have since been phased out. In fact, in 2016, the EPA issued a lifetime health advisory for both PFOA and PFOS of 70 parts per trillion, or nanograms per liter, in drinking water. But as you can see from this figure, this is really just the tip of the PFAS iceberg here. Other perfluorinated compounds and polyfluorinated compounds have started to and will ultimately continue gaining attention. Some of the newer compounds were introduced as replacement chemicals. For example, Genex was introduced to replace PFOA. Next slide, please. So where do PFAS come from, and what do we know about their human health effects? And they've been in use since the 1940s and are found in a wide range of materials and products such as household items or used as part of industrial processes. Mostly we hear about the aqueous film forming foams, or AFFF, that have been released at some of the fire training sites and firefighting training events. These PFAS are known to bioaccumulate in the environment and in the body, thus linking them to some of the human health problems such as infertility, increased risk of cancer, and some developmental problems. Next slide. What we see is that manufacturing industries such as metal plating, some of the fluorinated pesticides, and again, the use of AFFF contributes to the overall PFAS that are observed in the environment. And in fact, PFOS was used in chrome plating operations as part of the health and safety protocol to actually suppress the hexavalent chromium fumes. And as a result of these PFAS being used in many processes, we see them showing up in the landfill leachate, at wastewater treatment plants, at the airports, and again, the firefighting training facilities. Slide. Now, this PFAS timeline is full of very useful information on the production of PFOA and other PFAS and all the way up to where we are in 2020. I will only focus on a select few, really starting with 2016, with the US EPA issuing their final drinking water health advisory for PFOA and PFOS at 70 parts per trillion for the single compounds themselves and also the sum of the two compounds. In 2019, the EPA announced that their plans were to deal with PFAS, including proposed regulation. And so far in 2020, the EPA has issued preliminary determinations to regulate PFOA and PFOS. And this, of course, was prior to the pandemic, so we'll just see how far they progress. But there's a lot of movement and has been a lot of movement on the federal and state level towards regulating these compounds in drinking water sources. And I'll show a bit of that a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide. And, an obvious question here could be, well, why are folks so concerned about PFAS if they've been largely phased out of materials? And it's really that drinking water exposure pathway that's driving that concern. Researchers out of Harvard University analyzed EPA's data collected under the Safe Water Drinking Act that looked at the drinking water supply of communities across the country. And what you see on this screen is the blue shaded areas illustrate that PFAS were detected and the water supply that really shows that there was a widespread detection of PFAS in concentrations were in higher concentration in watersheds containing industrial sites, military fire training areas, AFFF certified airports, and again, the wastewater treatment plants. And that is compared to other watersheds without those point sources. Next slide, please. These maps are from the same study, and they show where concentrations of PFOS on the top map and PFOA on the bottom map exceeded the US EPA's health advisory level of that 70 parts per trillion. The results of this study revealed that the water supply of 6 million US residents had PFOA and PFOS greater than that actual EPA advisory. And it should be recognized that this study is a bit conservative because it only focuses on public water supplies serving greater than 10,000 individuals. That means that if people are on private wells or obtaining water from a supply serving less than the 10,000 people, then their water quality and PFAS concentrations were not accounted for in this study. Next slide. So in terms of proactive considerations and approaches for PFAS, it's important to understand the specific PFAS that are being targeted for regulation. So at the top of the presentation, I mentioned that there are over 5,000 we can monitor for 24 to mid-30s. So it's good to know what these individual states are actually regulating, and that comes across when we want to look at treatment technologies, sampling, and analytical techniques. So as you see from this table, there's a lot of variation in advisory levels. And in fact, some states have adopted that EPA advisory, while others, such as Michigan and New Jersey and the other Northeast states, have decided to use a more stringent approach and more stringent drinking water guidelines there. Next slide. This slide shows the current surface water guideline levels for PFAS, and only a few have standards for effluents. And of course, again, there's a lot of variation, but as more attention becomes focused on other media such as surface water, I think we'll see more states begin publishing additional standards. Next slide. And that same story holds true for the current soil screening levels for groundwater protection as shown in this table. And notice here that Texas has named many additional PFAS screening levels for soil as compared to the other states. And this again just highlights the large variation in PFAS values and actual PFAS we want to target on the state to state level. Next slide. This slide shows the current human health soil screening levels. Notice that these values are about 4 orders of magnitude higher than the screening levels for groundwater protection that I just mentioned in the previous slide. So in general, there are some screening levels for all media, and these values are continuing to be updated and can vary significantly from state to state. Next slide, please. So In terms of actual PFAS occurrences, we're looking at an interactive map from the Environmental Working Group's website. The map breaks down the occurrences at military sites there in purple, and drinking water in the blue, and other known sites in orange. And we do see clusters of occurrences primarily on the East and West Coast, as well as in the Midwest. Now, as a caution with using the map and any data you really find on the internet, it's always a good practice just to double check or even fact check what the individual state agencies have in terms of concentrations regarding the actual sites that they're dealing with, instead of just what's out there on the internet. Next slide, please. So for some of the sampling challenges, PFAS are ubiquitous or everywhere, and this can result in cross-contamination and even samples that are not representative of the actual site conditions. It's important to have a good quality assurance and quality control procedures so that the data collected is actually meaningful and can inform remediation approaches and also help the decision makers focus their priorities. You know, PFAS can be on samplers' clothing and gloves, and we have to take a special consideration in terms of the equipment that we have to use. I showed the study from Harvard University using the data from Safe Drinking Water Act, and it showed that some of the drinking water had PFAS. So if you're going to use water for blanks, you have to make sure that that water is PFAS free. Next slide, please. This table is a compilation of the best available PFAS sampling practices from the literature that we have incorporated into our field SOP for PFAS. And as you can see, there are some specific acceptable items versus prohibited items that need to be addressed when actually planning for these events. Some of these acceptable items, include cosmetics using during the sampling events, in addition to the actual equipment used to come in contact with the sample. Now, as I always say when I present this, is that this is more of a disclaimer. It's noteworthy to mention that the available best practices for PFAS sampling often lacks the research to validate some of the certain equipment or materials' ability to actually impact those samples. And as a rule of thumb, if you have any questions about the equipment, it's best to actually chat with the manufacturers to gain some more insights on the composition of that specific piece of equipment. Next slide. As for the analytical methods, there are a few at this point. US EPA has approved methods, but they are specifically for drinking water. Those methods are 537.1 and method 533. The 537.1 targets the long and short chain PFAS, while 533 was more focused on the shorter chain PFAS. There are some ASTM methods to help analyze for PFAS and other media besides drinking water. That can be wastewater, sediment, soil. And the EPA is working on additional methods for groundwater and surface water matrices. Next slide. So there's an assay, or really a sample prep, by the name of total oxidizable precursor, or TOP assay, that came out of academia. We know that polyfluorinated compounds can transform to perfluorinated compounds. TOP assay oxidizes these poly into the PERs using an excess of hydroxyl radicals under high temperature conditions. This technique can be quite useful if you want to understand additional PFAS risk at a site and the need to develop innovative treatment approaches to address those additional PFAS that are there. Next slide. So in terms of the evaluation of treatment technologies, there's research on optimal treatment technologies for PFAS and water that's ongoing. There was a study completed by the Water Research Foundation, and we're looking at that table now, back in 2016, that was evaluating full-scale treatment systems throughout the US to observe any decreases or treatment of PFAS as a result of that technology. The color coding here represents the removal efficiencies of the treatment methods, with yellow being a removal efficiency of less than 10%. Green is a large range there between 10 and 90%, and blue greater than the 90%. The study looked at a wide range of treatment methods across the top columns there. There's aeration, coagulation, flocculation, and even some oxidative techniques, which are all more conventional treatment technologies that are commonly used in municipal and even industrial facilities. Then we have more of the advanced technologies that can be the anion exchange resins or granular activated carbon filtration, as well as nano filtration and reverse osmosis. And what you can see from these results immediately is that conventional treatment technologies have some limited effectiveness on PFAS removal, with less than 10% removed. But granular activated carbon and the ion exchange are much more effective, removing over 90% of the larger chain PFAS and 10 to 90% of the shorter chain PFAS. We do see that the nanofiltration and reverse osmosis are the most effective, and they're able to even remove the smallest PFAS chain included in the study. Nanofiltration and RO are considerably more costly than a passive removal using media such as the GAC or the ion exchange, and recommended as a treatment strategies if short chain PFAS are present in the water, if you need to use that more aggressive approach. For longer chain PFAS, we see that ion exchange and GAC were considered adequate treatment methods from the study, but the study did conclude that all 4 treatments would need further investigation to determine some optimal design parameters for PFAS removal, and that can include consideration for disposal or even reject streams and some regeneration strategies. Next slide, please. So, in dealing with PFAS issues and going from unprepared to prepared on these issues, it's good to have a focused and proactive approach. Some of these proactive considerations include performing desktop evaluations to understand the site and any potential PFAS sources, have a sense of fire and emergency response activities, and if sampling is ultimately required, we have to use the appropriate methodology and analytical procedures that I've mentioned during this presentation. It's good to have a strategic and focused approach so that the data collected is actually meaningful and can be used to inform these decision makers on how to prioritize resources for their sites. Consider the BMPs, the best management practices to reduce or reuse the wastewater. Consider source control to focus in on or to reduce commingled flows with PFAS impacts. And if property transactions are a part of your core business, implementing standard operation procedures that evaluate current and future PFAS liabilities will be crucial as we see that regulatory landscape is evolving daily. For folks that have been dealing with permitting and renewals, be aware that requests for sampling and analysis is coming, and it's quite common these days for PFAS from these regulatory agencies. Again, just being prepared to evaluate your risk management and prioritization options if and when PFAS are in fact detected. Also, the community and employee engagement piece is important. There's a lot of media and social focus on environmental contaminants, including PFAS. So, focus on the factual scientific responses to the community to address their concerns. Next slide there. So for recommended activities, again, PFAS are ubiquitous, standards are low as I've shown, and they're based on quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of where the regulations are going to go. We do need a holistic view to site management with a combination of remediation, engineered controls, institutional controls, and a risk management approach. Really the first step is to, for site management is to develop a site-specific conceptual site model. And that's one that's on the screen pulled from ITRC's fact sheet. Proper assessment of the risk is important to ensure that the best outcomes, and this may require some stakeholder engagement. Next slide. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and the opportunity to present on PFAS. And back over to you, Rebecca.
Dr. Thomas, really, thank you so much for the insightful presentation. As an employee of a company heavily involved in marine firefighting and industrial firefighting, I could certainly relate. And it was good to kind of get an understanding from the scientific perspective as it pertains to PFAS. Our final speaker is Mr. Adam Davis. He's the Scientific Support Coordinator for NOAA's Emergency Response Division and Office of Response and Restoration. He's going to speak to the regulatory perspective on abandoned vessels. So again, for our viewers who are interested in learning more about Adam's background, please refer to the replay portal for his full bio. So Adam, the floor is yours, sir.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Adam Davis, I'm a NOAA Scientific Support Coordinator. I work for NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration Emergency Response Division. And, you know, when I was asked by Rebecca to present on this topic, you know, I explained to her, I said, well, you know, really, you know, NOAA's not a regulator, so I really can't offer a lot of the regulatory perspective, but maybe it would be beneficial to at least provide some of the federal perspective. And by that, I mean mostly from the emergency response side of things. So as a NOAA Scientific Support Coordinator, we're a special team under the National Contingency Plan. And, you know, we do provide that scientific and technical support. Specifically, with regards to abandoned and derelict vessels, this really comes under the umbrella of mostly Stafford Act response. So that's kind of what I'm going to focus on today, but I'll provide a little background material as well. Next slide, please. So, you know, before we get started, maybe we just talk a little bit about the scale, the causes, in terms of the background for ADVs. And then really what I kind of want to focus on is providing you folks with some resources that maybe help you in your approach to this problem. Devin talked about a lot of some of this, you know, in his presentation, so I'm going to skip over some of the material that he has already well covered. Thank you. Next slide. And next slide, please. So, you know, in terms of the scale of the problem, Devin talked about this a little bit. This is from that GAO report that he referenced. You know, this problem is ubiquitous. It's a nationwide problem. You know, typically, you know, if you look at this report, it seems to suggest it's mostly the coastal states that deal with this problem. But, you know, what you kind of get out of this GAO report is it is a nationwide problem. Typically, you know, most of the data suggests that it's a problem in coastal states, but that's really, I think, as much a reflection of that's where the data has been gathered. You know, this report suggested that, you know, 18 states, excuse me, from 2016, 28 coastal states were surveyed. Half reported having state-run programs. You know, there's various funding mechanisms really across the board. There's no national standard for this. You know, 18 of those states reported identifying about 5,600 abandoned vessels between 2013 and 2016 and removing about half of those vessels. Next slide. But that's just kind of the background and what I would refer to as the baseline of abandoned and derelict vessels. You know, then we have this, you know, scale of the problem that's challenged by these big events that we have. And this is really the kind of work that I've been involved in over the last several years. We're really going back to Hurricane Katrina. And these are the numbers from the abandoned and derelict vessels, non-commercial only, recreational and private only vessels that were generated from the storms Irma and Maria, and then Florence and Michael. And you can see, you know, in the state of Florida alone, you know, almost 2,000 vessels became abandoned and derelict as a result of these this natural disaster, Hurricane Irma. And then, you know, followed right on the heels of that was Hurricane Maria. We ended up with, you know, a total of about 4,000 vessels out of both of those storms, which is a pretty significant number when you consider the baseline, you know, of, you know, about 5,000 vessels nationwide. Next slide. So, you know, the next question becomes, you know, whose problem is it? And with regards to federal agencies, really, it varies, and I'm going to get into that a little bit. You know, if it's a hazard to navigation in a federally maintained waterway, really it's U.S. Army Corps that takes a lead there. You know, if it's an environmental or public health threat, you're really either talking about the Coast Guard, in the coastal zone or the EPA in the inland zone. And then, we get into these issues with regards to these, disaster generating events or disasters which generate a lot of ADVs. And really what we're talking about there is Stafford Act response, which is managed by FEMA in agreements or rather as requested by the state. And then, I do work for NOAA. We do have a small group within the Office of Response and Restoration that deals specifically with marine debris, but that is not from other than, my group, which provides support for emergency response. That's not for response. That's really for funding that's provided to states to sort of manage their own problem. Next slide. So in terms of, those sources of the problem, again, I'm going to focus more on this disaster-related aspect because that's the one that I've primarily been involved in over the years. And really what we're looking at is Stafford Act response there. There's always sort of this challenge between, this emergency support function 3, ESF 3, and ESF 10, emergency support function 10 issue with regards to how we're going to deal with abandoned and derelict vessels. When there's hazardous materials or potential pollution sources on these vessels, they're typically handled under emergency support function 10. And then when the vessel has been cleaned and those materials have been removed from the vessel, it really becomes an ESF 3 issue. And this has presented some challenges over the year because it's not really a consistent standard of how this applied from disaster to disaster. In hurricanes Katrina and Rita and Wilma, most of the abandoned and derelict vessels issues were managed under ESF 3. And a lot of the vessels were left in place. Recently, at least with regards to Hurricane Irma and Maria, we've really, dealt with the removal of the vessels specifically under ESF 10, even though there may be very minor pollution threats associated with these vessels. And then the real challenge, and this is a photograph from the Virgin Islands, is, it's one thing to sort of fund the removal. It's one thing to take the pollution off. That's fairly straightforward operations with regards to Coast Guard under a FEMA mission assignment, but the real challenge becomes, what do you do with them? Do the states have the capacity to process this material? Are there suitable locations to process these vessels once they're removed from the environment? We've seen this time after time after time, is that the real big delay in these ESF 10 responses has been, where are we going to process the vessels? So maybe that's one recommendation, and I'll get back to that in a minute. In terms of the chronic issues, as Devin discussed earlier, it's really sort of this two principal problems associated with that. Is it's the funding issue, and then it's a legislation and regulation issue. How do individual states what are the legal requirements for declaring a vessel abandoned and derelict? Can property be seized from individuals? Those are some of the real challenges and sources to this problem. Next slide, please. So then, what about solving the problem? Well, it's not as easy, right? It's easy to identify the problem. We all agree it's a problem, but, solving the problem really sort of takes a holistic approach. And I'm not going to put forth some strategy here. I think Devin highlighted some that are really important, but I'm going to show you some resources rather for sort of getting at some of these best practices, understanding what the state regulations are, and understanding some resources that are available to potentially help us solve the problem, excuse me. Next slide. Next. And so the first resource I'd offer up, coming from NOAA, is this, they call it the ADV Hub. And this is NOAA's Marine Debris Program, which is also under the Office of Response and Restoration. And it's really sort of a clearinghouse of the varied information that's available out there on ADV policies, state legislative requirements, regulatory, and it's really organized well on a state-by-state basis. It's very easy to get in there and really get a lot of information on what the resources are available in the state, who manages ADVs, and what the relevant regulations are with regards to them. And that's the link right there at the bottom of the page. You can easily get to this site if you just Google NOAA's Marine Debris Program ADV Hub. Next slide. So here's just a snapshot of one of those pages that you'll get to when you drill down to the state level on the ADV Hub. And I think it's very well organized in terms of, what is the state legislation. There's a small overview. It talks a little bit about funding, who are the points of contact for the state, and who manages the state programs. Next slide. Here's just an example of, as you drill down into that state page under the ADV Hub, some of the legal documents that are included there. Really this issue comes down to the state level with regards to what are the legal and regulatory issues with regards to defining a vessel as abandoned and derelict, allowing the state to either seize the vessel. You can't just take, personal property from folks. One of the big challenges with this is that each state has a very almost distinct definition of abandoned and derelict vessels. Some states have very robust programs. Some states have really very limited programs. With regards to North Carolina, we saw this challenge during Florence. The response to Florence is that while the state did have an abandoned and derelict vessel statute, it really had never been exercised. And by that, I mean, they don't really have an active program where they were declaring vessels abandoned and derelict, and they'd never gone through this process of seizing vessels from private owners post-storm. Next slide. One of the other resources that's available from the Marine Debris webpage that I think is of value to folks is the state response guides. And it's not all 50 states. These are primarily focused in the coastal zone. I believe there's 23 of them now. They're fairly new and fairly updated. You can get to those from the Marine Debris response page, and I'll just show you an example of some of the information that I think is of value to folks in these response guides. Next slide. And so this is sort of the first one, and I know, when you show this a flow chart to this to folks like this, they immediately sort of their eyes gloss over, but I'll show you an example a little closer in. This is the debris response flow chart, which is in the beginning of each one of those response guides. And, I like to call this sort of, whose monkey is it issue. And it really helps you navigate through, scenarios for abandoned and derelict vessels to determine which authorities are appropriate, which statutes apply, and how you might sort of solve the problem, or at least get to defining the problem. Next slide. So this is just a close-up of that chart. I really like it because I think it helps people sort of process through and think through, how they're going to address the problem, whether it's a vessel that's in a navigable waterway or not, whether it has pollution on it or not. These are all sort of critical items that have to be defined early on in terms of how you're approaching each vessel. And I think it's very helpful. There's a little bit of distinction, with regards to each state. And, those differences are accommodated in these charts for the ones that have been developed. But I think even nationally, there's a lot of value to these guides. Next slide. Talk about, just real quickly, another couple of resources. There's some best management practices that have been put out there by various folks over the years, from the Coast Guard, from industry, And then from the National Response Team, there's a recent, very recent update that occurred in 2020 that's on their website that I think offers some value to folks. You know, this is a complex problem. It's a problem that's not going away anytime soon. And so the more we can do to focus on these best management practices, the better off we'll be in the long run. Next slide. And, you know, the real punchline here, I think, is that this problem is not going away. And it's not going away with very simple solutions. If it was simple to solve, it would have been solved already. But, you know, really what we have to do is we have to continue to move forward on this because the problem is not going away. You know, there's lots of good programs out there. Some states have really benefited from good funding, from good legislation. They've been able to move forward on their programs. But it only takes, you know, a big disaster event to sort of upset that tea cart. We saw that happen in Florida. You know, typically their program, you know, is very well funded, very well run, lots of good regulations there. You know, millions of dollars in the budget, and then, you know, a disaster event like a hurricane comes and completely, you know, would wipe out their entire budget for the year, you know, just to manage some of those vessels. And then, you know, the solution becomes, well, there's a FEMA mission assignment request that's granted, but then it turns around and costs the state, you know, another, you know, 20 or 40 million dollars to solve the problem. So that's all I have for today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Adam, thanks so much for your presentation. I really appreciated the federal regulatory perspective and insight there. Gentlemen, I want to thank all three of you very much for your participation today and your willingness to share, of course, your knowledge and expertise with the Clean Waterways audience. It's a shame that we couldn't be in person this year. We are in unusual times with this pandemic, so where we would generally open up the floor to questions from a live audience, I kind of have some here in front of me that I'd like to go through. And of course, I also want to remind those who do tune in online to watch this presentation that each of you are welcome to reach out directly to all three presenters through the Clean Waterways replay portal. But without further, hesitation, I'd like to turn to Dr. Thomas first, if that's all right, for a few questions here with regards to PFAS and specifically to aqueous film forming foams. Are there fluorinated chemicals in all AFFF products?
Right. So all AFFF, those foams do contain PFAS. The Class B firefighting foams that are used to extinguish the flammable and combustible liquids and gases or petroleum grease fires can be separated into two categories that are those fluorinated foams as compared to those that are fluorine-free. So the AFFF are fluorinated, but there are fluorine-free foams. And one of the questions there is, can the fluorine-free foams have the same firefighting properties and capabilities to extinguish these fires the same way that these PFAS containing foams did? But there are some available products.
Okay. And what are the most effective methods to treat PFAS in waterways? Is there a silver bullet out there that the audience should be aware of, just to kind of to bring that full circle?
No silver bullet. To treat PFAS in water, the main field demonstrated methods at this point are the typically passive in nature. So using adsorption mechanisms such as ion exchange and granular activated carbon that I mentioned during the presentation. There are some concerns there with all of the media, because at some point you have to deal with that PFAS impacted media. Typically it's via incineration or some type of regenerative source or solvent solution to regenerate that media. There's definitely no silver bullet. I think it's all site specific. You have to know what else is in the water there. So for some of these adsorptive medias, they're going to absorb PFAS in addition to other organic compounds. So if there are co-mingled with other contaminants, then we have to understand what type of concentrations are there so that we can do a pre-treatment or some type of lead and lag vessel removal technology.
Interesting. I think your topic in your presentation is really relevant a lot to many different groups of those who would encompass the greater, I think, Clean Waterways audience. I mean, I can think of from your actual municipal marine firefighters to your actual private entities that conduct marine and industrial firefighting, and even to an extent the vessel owner and operators who hold AFFF or some sort of chemical that might be utilized on board in their shipboard systems to put out a fire. There's a lot of relevance here, and I think while we've seen a lot in the media, as you pointed out in your presentation, on the heightened attention from an environmental and human hazard perspective, I don't know that it's quite there yet on all the levels. So I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of enlighten us from a scientific perspective on this topic.
Absolutely.
I surely intend to connect you with our lead firefighting team. I know that there would be a lot of fruitful discussions there. Let's turn to the CADV, abandoned derelict vessel discussion. Devin, Adam, you both touched on this a little bit. Devin, why are commercial vessels so much more expensive than recreational vessels in your perspective?
I think a lot of the reason is just it's primarily the size and the scope. So part of it is just because they're larger vessels, they have there's a lot more to take care of. They're usually made of different construction materials. So you have kind of these lifespans of commercial vessels where originally they had wood hulls, which is somewhat a little bit easier to dismantle than you went to steel hulls, and that changes the methodology and the cost associated with. Where if you look at recreational vessels, they're primarily fiberglass wood based, and so it's a little bit less expensive just because of the construction materials. But one of the big costs associated with commercial vessels is this hazardous abatement piece. There's just so much. But there's a plethora of materials that were used historically that may not be used as much now, and they are really difficult to get rid of because they're everywhere. So if you deal with like soundproof, I mean, asbestos-containing materials, it was used for sound dampening and as a fire retardant in engine rooms, and so everything is wrapped, and so that cost alone to deal with ACM is tremendous. And the other reality is large vessels need large locations to go be deconstructed, and a 28-foot fiberglass hull that needs to be pulled out of the water can usually be easily towed to a launch ramp, and an excavator can make it into small pieces and put it in a drop box in the span of an hour or two. Whereas I think one of my last slides was a vessel that's located on the Columbia River, the LST 1166. It's been there for 10 years. They've looked at I mean, the only location where it can be taken to is one shipyard, because it will not get a tow permit because of the hull's failing, and the cost to deconstruct it at that location. I'm sorry, just to abate the hazardous materials, to get it prepped for scrap, is probably in the neighborhood of $2 to $3 million just for the hazardous abatement. And so then it goes back to the funding source, and it's just kind of a vicious circle that goes round and round. So it's easier just to leave the vessel in place. So that's why commercial vessels are so much more expensive. It's just size, limited disposal and deconstruction locations to do it, and the cost of actually disposing of and dismantling the construction materials themselves.
Understood. Do you foresee any impact to the whole CADV issue with the recent economic changes that we're seeing this year?
It's an interesting question, because I think on the recreational derelict and abandoned vessels, if people are in economic stress, it's more likely that there'll be more recreational vessels that can become derelict and abandoned. So that kind of, at least I was having a discussion with the program manager for the Washington State's program, and they saw some uptick in the last recession with not only a drop in funding because there was less people likely to pay their fee for the derelict vessel removal program, but there was the inventory started to get larger because there were more people who were not able to maintain their vessels in a serviceable condition. At the commercial level, I think the same could occur. We've seen a lot of, there's been a lot of changes in the domestic offshore market for marine transportation, both in the Gulf of Mexico and, certainly on both the coastlines, as opposed, as you look at maritime uses. And so you've got commercial entities that are grappling with what do they do with these liabilities that they have now? I mean, they used to be for-profit enterprises. A vessel was a for-profit enterprise, and if it's not out working, or if the economy's tight and it's tied up at a dock, it becomes a liability. And at some point, I suspect we'll see, not now, maybe in the next, it could be as much as 24, 36 months from now, if there are companies that become insolvent or go through bankruptcy or don't have the financial means to take care of those vessels, they're either going to become new public funding burdens because there is no private option to dispose of it, or those companies are going to seek out alternatives to try to remove that liability by passing it along to a new ownership group and get rid of that liability at a much lower cost than actually deconstructing it. So I think that probably over the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see an increase in the inventory of CADVs and no changes to the funding source other than it's going to further be depleted.
Interesting. Yeah, as you were talking, I was just thinking of just in the last 5, 6, 7 months alone, some articles that have come to fruition just from economic impacts from our maritime, operating perspective. Some of the issues that they've faced just as a result of, already struggling, maritime, operating environment, to then now, of course, introducing all of the new complexities on an economic level that have really put a hinder on some of these U.S. operators, just for example. And absolutely. And
if I can throw one other analogy out there, is that it's, these vessels do not go away.
Right.
The first case study that I led off with was a vessel that in 1987, which was a long time ago. Some of us on this call were maybe not born yet, but some of us were. Those are the heydays of our early years. But it was sold for $4 million. I mean, it was a profitable enterprise in 1987. And when you look at how long these vessels were, the way they were built for longevity. Mm-hmm. And so 1987 was not that long ago. And today's commercial vessels are built for the same serviceable lifespan. So to me, the really interesting commentary is that vessel that we picked up in Steamboat Slough last year, 20, 30 years ago, was a viable for-profit enterprise. And how many vessels today that have been built since 1987, so we're talking, essentially 30 to 40 years later, have been built and are eventually going to end up in that same condition? Because unlike trucks or cars, where there's a value and there's a waste stream that you can generally take those into, and the cost of disposal is relatively low, these commercial vessels are extremely expensive to get rid of. And obviously there's an exponential cost if they're not dealt with while they're floating. So the idea of taking a vessel to a location to be scrapped while it's floating, and again, as a commercial dive company, we're more than happy to go pick these things up and shake the water out of them, but it's exponentially more expensive to pick up the vessel and tie it back up once it's sunk, or take care of it. And we just did a project on the East Coast, which was not a derelict vessel, but we did a salvage. Well, I guess it could be considered an abandoned vessel. We picked up a vessel, pumped the fuel out, and tied it back off to the buoy where it was, which it then promptly sank again. And that's not, I haven't seen that in a while, but that's not unusual to see that happen over and over again. And we just have this backlog of vessels that are environmental threats, as well as hazards to navigation, and can impede economic movement of marine transportation. And they're everywhere. Right. And there's no solution. And all we're doing is dealing with it. Once something kind of reaches a certain threshold and a certain visibility to the public and other concerned stakeholders, then that one project is dealt with, and we don't have an answer for the other 99 problems that we're ignoring at the time.
No, it's interesting, having the discussion on the abandoned vessels, and then just thinking of case studies, even where aside from just the sinking and environmental hazard, you have the potential for a fire hazard, even with these vessels that are not being properly maintained. We've seen that out in California alone, just within the last 12 months, with several vessels down in Southern California having a fire ensue within a port, and now creating not only a hazard to surrounding vessels and of course the human element perspective, but then of course in the firefighting aspect, you then potentially could be introducing a PFAS related AFFF foam, which is then going to compound. Again, it makes me proud that we picked a title for this session called 99 Problems, because it just doesn't end, really. It's just a revolving door.
It really is, and to all the points that were made with the group here, dealing with the problem in hand now when things are manageable is better than dealing with the challenge and the potential contingencies that can occur if it sinks or if it catches fire. Some of these vessels that are beached become dumping grounds for slops and everything else, and they become an even larger environmental threat than when they were originally placed there. So yeah, it is 99 problems, and the one solution is finding a consistent funding source and dealing with the backlog, not on a case-by-case basis, but actually dealing with it right now and developing a long-term solution.
Sure. Adam, I do have a few questions from you
Sure.
for you from the regulatory federal perspective. What
Yeah.
do you see as the most limiting factor when it comes to solving the ADV problem?
Well, Devin touched on a lot of that. It's really, time and money, one of the other challenges, is the state legislation specifically, for declaring a vessel abandoned or derelict. And what we've seen, and this is exactly what, Devin mentioned as well, is the biggest challenges we have are when these large, expensive commercial vessels get transferred at the end of their life stage to a private entity, which doesn't have the funding. And, you hear these stories all the time. They don't have the means. It's some fella who has a dream of opening a casino on the water or whatever, and he buys this, 200 foot long, or 180 foot long vessel, and has, never operated a commercial enterprise and doesn't have an understanding of what it costs to maintain a vessel like that, what it costs to repair a vessel like that, and then certainly doesn't have the means to deal with it once it becomes, sunk or something of that nature. That's a huge, huge issue. We see in these storms lots of times, these commercial vessels sometimes get passed up when they're at the end of this life stage because, you can't, there's different regulations that are applied, or the owner steps forward with good intentions and says, well, I'm going to take care of it, gets it tied back off to the dock. And then, a storm 20 years later, here comes this vessel again, right? And once they've identified as a chronic, as a problem, they're going to come back, and they're going to remain problems unless the time and attention and money specifically, is if that vessel is addressed. It's just like Devin said, they don't go away, and they only get more expensive, right? That's the sort of the punchline too. So, the question becomes, well, who's going to pay for it? Yeah. Why should the public, the taxpayer in the state, pay for someone's bad decision, And in terms of the solution to that, I think Devin touched on this, and I fully agree. You can't drive a car in most states without private insurance, and you certainly couldn't just park your car, on the street somewhere and leave it there, right? They would come back to you somehow. So, putting up a surety bond for these vessels, not allowing commercial entities to sell to private entities without putting forth a surety bond, I think that's one solution to the problem. But if you don't have legislation in the state that allows you to do that, you can't just make up a new rule, right? My kids complain about that all the time. They said, well, Dad, you just introduced a new rule. I said, well, I'm the dictator. This is not a democracy. I don't have to go to, through legislation, to get a new rule. And, the states, I don't think they fully understand the problem, and there's a tendency to kick that can down the road. And they really haven't looked at the problem as, this is something that if we don't do now, it's going to cost us more later. So it really kind of falls back to that: change the legislation, right? And then do something about the funding, right? And, the burden, I don't think, should fall on the public. I think it should fall back to these entities that, if you want to take the risk, to go into that enterprise to buy that vessel, well, you need to demonstrate you have the capacity to be able to handle it when it becomes a problem, not if it becomes a problem, when it becomes a problem, because it will become a problem.
Sure. Devin, it looked like you wanted to chime in on that for a second.
Yeah, I was just going to emphasize the point that Adam made is that this really, there's a public funding approach that I think we're handling right now, which is dealing with an interim issue. I mean, it's just an interim solution, and it's on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
This really should be a private industry solution that's generated. I can't underscore enough the idea that, these vessels are built for a purpose. They're built for profitable use. Profit is generated year over year by owners. And we need to change the paradigm from, when I'm done with it, I'll pass it along to a secondary use market that either can use it in a still for-profit manner. But what we do have to sever is that change in ownership that goes from, hey, I'm selling it because it still has serviceable life, a genuine serviceable life, versus I'm going to sell this liability for much less than it really will cost to deconstruct it to somebody who doesn't really understand the cost associated or the liability that they are taking in exchange for that vessel. Right. And that's what I think, some concept in the private market, a new insuring product, a bond or something should be put up, because the very people who make all the money from these commercial vessels, we have commercial vessels. We've got vessels we've had for literally 40 years. At some point, we have to decide, do we responsibly get rid of it? We've profited off of its use for years. And how do we make sure that we preserve some of that money that's made for either an insurance product or a bond or something else, or some third-party option that allows the last owner to tap into money that's been put into a fund somewhere. So it can't be a public solution. It can be an interim solution, an interim public funding solution, but it can't be a long-term solution. This is a private enterprise issue that needs to be addressed. But to add a point, there has to be, the only way that that's going to occur is regulation or legislation that forces that private industry paradigm shift.
Right. Yeah. Very, very similar actually to the whole Open 90 regulations, so to speak.
Sure.
Right. You had this regulatory body born, which essentially created this requirement for vessel owner operators to have a vessel response plan on board. And within that, you had these private responding organizations, whether it be an oil spill response organization or salvage and marine firefighting provider. And so that regulation nationally created, it born this whole national response infrastructure that we have today, that maybe back in the early 90s or before that even didn't exist. Gentlemen, that's all I have for questions. Do you have any further comments?
No, just thank you for the discussion. I appreciate it. I certainly benefited from the other speakers as well, and wish you all well.
Yeah, I would echo the same thing. I mean, it looks like we handled 2 of the 99 problems here today. So take all our recommendations. We're 2% closer to the solution than we were when we started 90 minutes ago.
Maybe we'll do a to be continued for next year and kind of just continue to grow on all these different issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just echo here that thank you for that opportunity to present. And, we're making strides towards PFAS, but there are a lot of unknowns, and we'll see where that lands in the new regulation period.
Good deal. Well, gentlemen, thank the 3 of you so much for joining us, for remaining adaptable and kind of working with us to kind of get on this virtual sphere. I also want to give a very much deserved shout out to the entire Clean Waterways event organizing committee, because without them, our industry wouldn't have these opportunities to engage and talk about real issues and possible solutions, lessons learned and case studies, and come together for these really valuable networking opportunities. So I do want to give a very much deserved thank you to the entire Clean Waterways Committee for creating this environment for us, despite everything that we're going through on the pandemic level and outside of this. Again, to all the viewers, if you want to ask direct questions, please feel free to do so via the replay portal. You can also find more information about each speaker. And yeah, I just want to say, please stay healthy, continue to be vigilant, and I look forward to seeing you guys next year.
Thanks.
Same here. Thank
All
you.
right. Cheers, everybody. Take care.
Cheers.
Take care.
All right.